Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Another difficult day in the Middle East as the US cautions Israel on the timing of its planned ground invasion of Gaza. The silence was short-lived as yes activists lash out, saying voting no was a shameful act, appalling and mean-spirited, they said, and a whole lot more, including they've renewed their push for a treaty. Now, I'll explain how all of this is a fight that's hurting the PM, who seems too weak to stand up for democracy. Plus, despite Australians rejecting the voice, the Victorian government is persisting with their excessive cultural heritage laws. It's like the mess in WA all over again. This time it involves the Grampians National Park and fines of up to $350,000. And it's the ABC's day in the hot seat at Senate estimates, with the boss David Anderson grilled on everything from expensive legal fees to controversial coverage of events in Israel and its so-called balance that we didn't see during the Voice campaign.
His language was unfortunate. He knows that he's distressed people by using that language. As I said, he's quite remorseful that that happened.
You're running gross misinformation, saying Hamas senior leader says there were no plans to target civilians in Israeli attack. Is that true, Mr Anderson?
Well, we know that not to be true, because we know that they slaughtered innocent Israelis.
That's right. So why is that on your YouTube channel?
Senator, you've brought that to my attention. We will have a look at it. You're asking for me to apologise to Mr Russell. I'm not going to apologise to Mr Russell.
But first, as important as the situation in the Middle East continues to be, and as important as the Prime Minister's trip to Washington also is, the continuing fallout from the government's failed voice referendum, well, that's still reverberating even today. And that's because while the constitutionally entrenched Indigenous voice is well and truly dead, the issues around it are even more urgent than ever, given the statement of anger and vitriol issued by leading voice activists. Now, what's obvious with the release of a statement from some, but not all, most of though, pro-voice Indigenous activists, is the scale of their ambition. And the danger for our country, if their bitterness is not adroitly handled, is that the division the voice referendum unleashed could intensify rather than subside. Now, the absolutely critical feature of the referendum defeat is not that it was a rejection of Aboriginal people. And it was not even a rejection of recognition in the Constitution, although I now think that's off the table for years, if not decades. In rejecting the voice, voters did not reject more and better action to address Indigenous disadvantage, particularly in remote communities where it's concentrated. In fact, on that point, the Prime Minister is right, that the voice debate, despite the defeat, has at least focused our collective mind on much of the problems. What clearly was rejected, though, was the voice itself and the whole separatist agenda embodied in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the mantra of voice, treaty and truth. And that's what the activists, most of them at least, are having trouble coming to grips with. Here's what their statement said, and I quote, "The majority of Australians," it says, "have committed a shameful act, whether knowing or not." Now, shameful. Shameful. It should never be shameful that we have a free vote in a democracy as ours. That's a good thing. The activists went on arguing that the collective rejection of the voice by voters was, their statement said, so appalling and mean-spirited as to be utterly unbelievable. They went on saying it will remain unbelievable and appalling for decades to come. This is our democracy, and they don't like it. You see, the activists behind the voice and behind the whole Uluru Statement agenda don't really accept the legitimacy of modern Australia. The rightful owners of Australia, they think, are still the Aboriginal people who make up less than 4% of our population. And here's the proof. It reads in the statement that we do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours, they said. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in our country, not the other way around, they said, that requires recognition because, and I quote, "our sovereignty has never been ceded." Well, so much for that voice soft sell of a polite and generous invitation, the PM called it, to come together. That very statement about sovereignty never being ceded, that's the radical line espoused by the likes of Lydia Thorpe. And the soft sell you heard for months and months in the Voice campaign, that was just to get you over the line before the true colours could be revealed, as they're being revealed to us now in this angry statement. And strangely, even though our country has never been less racist, never been more concerned with Indigenous well-being, at least for this Indigenous activist class, the bitterness has never been greater. This is part of the whole identity politics poison. This kind of thinking is, as distinguished constitutional lawyer and Yes supporter Credlin said in The Australian yesterday, a dead-end car wreck for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians alike. Yet it's what's driving the heroic commission in Victoria to double down on treaty and truth, despite even Victoria's rejection of the voice. It's what's behind the move by the Sydney City Council today to demand the rebranding of statues of colonial figures like Lachlan Macquarie. And it's the thinking behind the use of cultural heritage laws to stop climbing in the Grampians in Victoria, because at the heart of it, these activists think the country belongs to some of us, not all of us. Or at least that some have a privileged claim over it because they've got ancestral years on some figurative clock. Despite the left telling us for years and years, under the guise of multiculturalism, that we're all Australians by what we contribute, and that's not then measured by how long we've lived here. Now, this post-voice fallout is going to be a real problem for Anthony Albanese personally and for his government. Because if he gives in to the treaty and truth push inside his own party, he'll mightily offend all the Labor no voters who expect their votes to be taken seriously. And pollsters estimate that 40% plus of Labor's heartland opposed the voice. For a PM that garnered one of Labor's lowest primary votes in history at last year's federal election, that statistic is deadly. And it's a sign too of the poison he unleashed by pushing on with a referendum on such a sensitive topic. It's some sort of personal trophy, almost without any serious attempt at bipartisanship. But even though the opposition leader picked the national mood much better, it's still an issue for Peter Dutton as well. He needs to really show that saying no to the voice wasn't saying no to Aboriginal Australians, certainly not by going along with treaties and truth-telling, but by coming up with a much better policy to address disadvantage, not business as usual. Now, the gap will never be closed unless Aboriginal children go to school and they succeed at school the same as everyone else. Yet, in remote Australia, despite the billions, truancy is often more than 50%. It'll require a lot of work and real change, but until kids go to school, adults go to work, and communities are safe, like Tony Abbott used to say, much of remote Australia will remain a failed state. And there will be ongoing disadvantage from the grievance mongers, the elites, to exploit. By exposing where the billions spent go, to expose how they leave Canberra but do not reach the people on the ground that need the help, that's the urgent job of a national audit. Now, the PM won't like it. The Aboriginal activist class controlling the power and the billions, they'll hate it. But if we are ever going to sort this mess out and close the gap, sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant. All right, let's go to Cameron now for the headlines. I tell you, it's a fascinating day today, Senate estimates. Goodness me, the ABC in the gun. Sky News political reporter, Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. Tech giant Microsoft will invest $5 billion to boost Australia's cyber defences. The new commitment was unveiled alongside the Prime Minister on the second day of his visit to Washington. Microsoft will build up to 29 data centres, train 300,000 workers, all with the aim to make Australia a global leader in cloud computing.
We're getting ahead. We're getting some competitive advantage in the region and indeed in the globe.
The tech giant will also work with the Australian Signals Directorate to shield businesses and individuals from cyber attacks.
People's data, the integrity around that data is sacrosanct, and whatever we can do to work with commercial partners to see that those defences tightened, that's a good thing.
The day started with a visit to the Arlington National Cemetery. The PM paid his respects to fallen US soldiers and visited the grave sites of 2 Australians laid to rest there. The backdrop for the trip, Israel's ongoing war against Hamas. The US President told Prime Minister Netanyahu there needs to be a continuous flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
We are playing our part in providing humanitarian relief. We think that is very important, and I know that President Biden has been working strongly on that.
While in Washington, Anthony Albanese heads to Congress to lock in legislative support for the AUKUS submarine pact. But the PM says he won't sweeten the deal beyond the $3 billion pledge to boost the US industrial base.
Well, we think that our support is appropriate, but the AUKUS arrangements are in the interests of Australia to play our role. We don't seek to just be someone who is watching.
And the government's got to get the deal back on track, because for Australia to be strong, that gives us the greatest chance of peace in our region.
The focus tomorrow will shift to deepening cooperation with the United States on critical minerals.
The minerals that will power the globe in the 21st century, things that Australia has significant amounts of.
President Joe Biden will host Anthony Albanese for a state dinner at the White House. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Right, another big week. PM, of course, in Washington, D.C. Senate estimates, as I said, underway. Middle East, a crisis point. And the fallout from the PM's voice referendum continues to reverberate. Joining me now for all the latest, the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly. Well, Paul, I want to get your take. Let's step back for a moment, because you and I haven't spoken on camera since the referendum, although we were both at a conference over the weekend and it was top of mind for a lot of people. What's interesting is, yes, it's an absolutely seismic result. Couldn't have been stronger than no vote for the PM. Some are saying internationally, this is our first national vote on identity politics anywhere in the world. But still, we're a week and a bit on now. The PM seems paralysed by the result and unable to take charge of this situation. Where does he go from here, Paul?
I think, Peter, this is a very challenging outcome for the Prime Minister. He said that he accepts the result, and that, of course, is the easy part. His task now is one of healing and attempting to unite the country. That won't be easy. His focus is going to be very much, I think, on practicalities, on closing the gap. He needs to make a renewed effort there, working with Peter Dutton, and I think we'll see that. But the Prime Minister's problem is, I think, the extent to which some of the Aboriginal leaders supporting the yes case now go radical. And we've seen this in the recent statement, of course, where they're talking about sovereignty, they're talking about legitimacy, and they are presenting a very distorting and misleading view of the vote. They're saying that the vote was a vote against reconciliation. Well, that's not right. It wasn't a vote against reconciliation. It wasn't a vote against the Indigenous peoples as such. It wasn't a vote inspired by racism. But to the extent that this narrative is accepted by some of the Indigenous leaders and by some of the progressives, and I think that will be the case, that'll be a problem for the Prime Minister, because he can't align himself with that sentiment as he attempts to reposition.
Surely, though, he's got to dump the Makarrata Treaty Commission. It's in the budget. He was pressing on with that well before the Voice. The Voice is a holy, or unholy, I'd say, a troika. You've lost the vote on the Voice comprehensively, Prime Minister. You can't now move to treaty, which I'd argue is way more contentious. Surely that's got to go.
Peter, I think this is a really difficult issue for the Prime Minister, and I think to a certain extent he's wedged. Now remember, he said repeatedly he stood by the Uluru Statement in full. voice treaty truth-telling. Now consider his options. If he walks away from the treaty, he will be attacked by much of the Indigenous leadership. He'll be attacked by the Greens. He'll be attacked and alienate a lot of progressive voters who voted yes. And he'll be in trouble in those seats where there's a Labor-Green contest. So if he walks away, there is a problem. But of course, he's going to face pressure here from the Peter Dutton-led Liberal Party, because if he stands by the treaty, Peter Dutton will say, well, he hasn't listened to the people. He hasn't adjusted his core position. He wants to maintain the Uluru Statement. He wants to maintain the treaty. And I think in that sense, Peter Dutton and Jacinta Price will be able to wage a very effective campaign against Anthony Albanese. So in this sense, I think he's got difficulties. He's got very substantial political difficulties, regardless of which way he goes.
We're already seeing that, though, in the polls out since Saturday, a week ago, since the vote. I mean, we're already seeing that reverberate in the polls. I made the point, 40% of the no vote was in the Labor heartland seats. And this is a PM, let's not forget, yes, he's had an extraordinary honeymoon against the coalition in the early months, but this is a Prime Minister that only 3 out of 10 Australians voted for. So, he might seem more formidable than his electoral results at last year's election actually show. And of course, there's no Scott Morrison this time.
Well, there is a leadership issue here because Anthony Albanese made The Voice a test of his own leadership. He's done that for the past 12 to 18 months, and it hasn't been successful. So the issue now will be, what is the quality of his leadership when it comes to the economy, inflation, cost of living, the energy transition, power prices, excessive regulation, getting young people into the housing market, the industrial relations system. These are the issues that matter. And the question now will be whether Anthony Albanese can display the leadership required of a Prime Minister on this range of issues, and they are very challenging structural issues.
Just on that point, though, I mean, this is the first time in a long time we've had a truly left Labor Prime Minister, and that the organ of the caucus is more to the left than the right. We know that the party out of that August conference is more to the left than the right. So, things like energy, he has a challenge bringing energy back to sort of the Labor right or centre ground. He won't. Difficult to see that happening, because even though Bowen's nominally from the right, the policy is absolutely hard left. He's got issues with immigration. He's got obviously issues with Indigenous politics coming out of this voice. He's got issues on cost of living and his own commitments made, very clear commitments at the last election. So how does he reset, given he's a man of the left, the parties of the left, the caucuses of the left? How does he reset somewhere towards even the Labor right to win back those people who walked away from him in the voice vote?
Well, it won't be easy, and in this sense, it goes to the question of delivery. Remember, Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister pledging to increase living standards, pledging to cut power prices, pledging to deliver on real wages growth. Now, at the end of his first term, when he goes to the next election, he's got to have some progress made on these issues. Now, you've identified the fact that to a certain extent this is a government of the left, and I think that's true. But what we're going to see in the next year or so is the real character of this government. What does this government really believe? What are going to be the real substance of its policies, and are they going to work? And the point I would make about this, Peter, is all these challenges are very substantial. We're talking here about fundamental structural problems. This is not easy.
Yeah.
You can't solve these problems quickly. You can't solve these problems overnight. So I must say that I do think he's going to find this particularly difficult, but he's got to be able to go to the next election with some runs on the board here.
All right, well, let's go to his current visit to Washington, quickly followed, of course, by the visit to China. And we know that, the Washington security class has woken up to the China risk. We know that they were very upset, let's say, not so long ago about the Port of Darwin issue. We saw it dropped out and buried on Friday night. The government now is going to do nothing about the lease of the Port of Darwin, which occurred during the Turnbull government era. He's got talks there in the US with President Biden about AUKUS. We know that a lot of Republicans are very nervous about AUKUS. We saw some announcements today. They're not, I think, very meaningful in a sense about Microsoft and cyber issues. But he has a strategic two-step over the next fortnight in the United States, saying the things the United States, our alliance partners, want to hear. At the same time, he's going to China. There's been some big concessions made to China. He's had some wins too. But it feels like China is letting go of Chongli and changing, issues with wine tariffs, etc., as a bit of a play. And he's falling for it.
Well, at the moment, China's the country making the concessions. Australia hasn't made concessions. I think that's a pretty important point. But in relation to his talks in the United States, yes, the Microsoft announcement is very important. The big game in America is AUKUS. There's no doubt at all about that. And getting the legislation through the Congress, and of course the Congress is a real mess at the moment. So essentially it's important that we see the President and the Prime Minister coming together, and I'm certain we'll see this in terms of a renewed commitment to the AUKUS agreement. I think the fact that the Prime Minister is in Washington before he goes to China is a good thing, because they'll clearly be talking about China, and clearly we can see that President Biden has taken a tough stand towards China. He wants a strong balance of power in the Asia-Pacific. That accords with Anthony Albanese's position. But at the end of the day, the Americans have got to put their money on the table and show that they can deliver on AUKUS. And so in that sense, the pressure at the moment is on the United States.
All right, we'll see how that all plays out. Paul Kelly, thank you as always. All right, after the break, we're going to talk about the voice rejection and the play out in Victoria with these cultural heritage laws. Mountain climbers now being threatened with fines of up to $350,000. Plus, a bit later, the ABC's shocking coverage of the Middle East war laid bare today in Senate estimates. Welcome back. Still to come, the City of Sydney is set to embark on a review of colonial statues that one councillor has deemed offensive. The statues, not the review. But first, even more evidence that the Australian people made the right call by rejecting the PM's Voice to the Parliament proposal a little over a week ago. In Victoria, visitors of the famous Grampians National Park are being threatened with $346,000 fines for allegedly breaching the state's draconian cultural heritage laws. You think WA was bad? Victoria wrote the book. This comes after rock climbing was banned in 2019 in large parts of the Grampians, one of the world's top locations for rock climbing, all in the name of protecting Aboriginal rock art, much of which is invisible, I'm told, to the naked eye. Joining me now to discuss this, Victorian MP, Libertarian MP David Limbrick, and Mike Tompkins, the President of the Australian Climbing Association. Gentlemen, welcome. Mike, you represent climbers who have loved and looked after and climbed the Grampians for decades. Explain to us what's going on.
Well, we believe that a climber who has left his car on a dirt road in the Grampians has received a threatening letter from First Nations State Victoria and has had visits to his house asking him to submit to questioning over unknown allegations of activity.
Well, what do you know about it, David?
Well, my understanding is that this is part of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I think that the larger issue here is that we have a situation where government bureaucrats have been empowered with these powers to effectively intimidate people for parking on the side of the road. I think it's absolutely outrageous. We saw during COVID what happens when you have these authorised officers with these extensive powers, and now we have it in a situation out of the Premier's own department, which is going around and effectively intimidating people that they suspect might be climbing illegally in the park. But really, all I'm aware of is that someone was parked on the side of the road and they were suspicious and they've gone and hunted them down.
So what's the rules with climbing and the prohibitions on climbing? Because when this law was brought in, and I seem to recall it was in and around the COVID period, or I just said 2019, so just on the cusp of COVID, what can you and can't you do now in our national parks in Victoria?
Well, 80% of the rock climbing in the Grampians has been banned during 2022. But I think it's important to note that this is not just about rock climbing anymore. This affects all park users. Parks Victoria has brought in new legislation that's effectively banned everybody from the park and then allowed them back in under a very strict table of activities. So this affects bushwalkers, hikers, botanists looking at wildflowers, everybody, photographers.
And what are they concerned about, Mike?
Protecting cultural heritage is what it's all about.
But I was just going to make the point, I mean, people who use these national parks, I've been in national parks, I've seen them, they're custodians. I mean, they go in parks because they love them. I see them take every bit of rubbish out. They look after their parks. Why don't we just protect designated Aboriginal sites? Fair enough. Let's know where they are and protect them. But why can't the rest of Australia use these national parks?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the problem has been is that they've been trying to identify these sites. They've dragged their heels on it, and they've got this unacceptable situation now where large parts of the park are just closed off because they haven't done the assessments, they haven't identified the sites, and as a solution, which I don't think is a great solution, they've just removed access, which, we've got a situation where you don't have access to something that taxpayers are paying to fund. I don't think it's a good thing.
What about Mount Arapiles? Because that is known around the world as one of Australia, at least, world's best climbing sites. What can you tell us there?
Mount Arapiles is still under threat. There's parts of Arapiles are banned, significant parts, the main central location of Arapiles. They've asked nobody to climb there, and that's effectively banned, and there's about 50 signs all along the base of Arapiles in the main section. And it is world-renowned, as is the Grampians. These are particularly valuable locations, not just for rock climbing, but for many things. And I think it's very important to note that Victoria, Australia, is a world outlier here. All around the world, these activities like rock climbing are celebrated as wholesome activities everybody should participate in. What is it about Victoria, Australia that's different? Why is it that we have to be shut out of these amazing places rather than celebrating them?
And I would imagine the times that I've seen rock art in the north, in and around, say, Owen Pelly or areas like that, it tends to be in cave places where it's been protected from erosion over time. How is a rock climber climbing the face of an exposed site likely to damage rock art? But even if there was rock art on that area, why don't we just quarantine that specific area, but allow the other part of the park to be used?
The impressive visual locations, of which there's a handful in the Grampians, were protected years ago, and there's fencing and cages around them. The rest of the findings are very subtle in nature. It's not like Kakadu. This is an area that's been raised by bushfire for generations, so there's not much left. This is merely it's the domain of archaeologists and anthropologists trying to piece together history, which is all well and good, but does that mean everybody has to be excluded from the entire park?
Help me out here, David. I don't understand. When these sorts of laws came into force in WA, there was an outcry. The new Premier is forced to say he will repeal the laws. Here in Victoria, I can't even remember a debate or a media write-up when they went through the Parliament. Or did they even go through the Parliament?
Like a lot of these laws were around, like a lot of the specific things were regulations that were done with powers that weren't specifically around this. So it's hard to know, but I think what we're seeing here is a situation where these parks users, like climbers, who are, my understanding is they're very responsible. I've met with many climbers and they're very responsible and want to cooperate. And in other places around the world, as you say, the rock climbers help maintain this cultural heritage in other places, like in the United States. The idea that they're going to be destroying it, I mean, it sort of goes right up against this reconciliation concept, where instead of like partnering with climbers and things like this, we have a situation where they're excluded.
Look, imagine a place like Rome. No one would ever be allowed to go to Rome if the whole place was completely preserved and blocked off to protect heritage, which is what they're trying to do here. The rest of the world seems to be able to live with its cultural history and modern life. It doesn't seem like they can in Victoria. Have you got a website that people can go and signal any support for your cause?
Yes, the ACAV website, just Google Australian Climbing Association Victoria. There's all sorts of stories there.
Great. I know my viewers will be straight onto that. Mike Tompkins, thank you. David Limbrick, great to have your company as always.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, that appearance today by the ABC's managing director, extraordinary scenes at Set and Estimates. One of the senators pushing his buttons joins me after the break. Plus more voice activists, they seem incapable of accepting the will of the Australian people. Welcome back. Still to come, the latest on the war in Israel, including potential for escalation, God forbid, with Iran. But first, let's go to the Senate estimates today. The ABC in the hot seat. One of the women spearheading that grilling, Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Holly Hughes, who joins me now. There's a lot in today, Holly. Thank you for your time. I want to get into. Let's start, though, with the underlying financials of the ABC, because the boss got a 12% pay rise this year. The reach of the ABC went down 4%. His pay picked up 12%, an extra $120,000 in his pocket. That's his increase alone. Now, $120,000, as you know well, Holly, that's a hell of a lot more than the average Australian earns in a whole year, but they're paying for it.
Look, absolutely. But Senator Roberts was asking some questions around this today. And Mr Anderson was very clear with his Chief Financial Officer that his pay rise was actually only 2.5%, was $25,000. We've had a look at the annual report. It obviously shows that it's a $120,000 difference from last year to this year. And I think there's probably been a little bit of trickiness again in not releasing all of the parts of the package that go towards making up that figure. And, this is what we see about the ABC. Everything's just half true, half told, all a little bit tricky. And there's always more work to do after we spend 4 or so hours with them today.
What about all the spending, across the board? Yes, the ABC has a Rolls-Royce view of where they put their money, but The Voice is a good example. Why did they need to spend $150,000 sending 30-plus journalists to Garma for The Voice? I mean, we had Matt Cunningham, our Darwin reporter, and he would have done the filming and the voice recording and everything, probably drove the car to get himself to Garma. Why do they need $150,000 spent on a weekend?
Oh, well, that's not how the ABC does it. You know that, Peter. It's the Rolls-Royce of media and all the equipment that they've got and the way that it works. And I'm sure they've got employment agreements that operate like a shop floor, otherwise than journalists who work for a commercial network and probably work longer hours and have to deal with different types of conditions. I did ask with regards to the Voice spending. What was clear was we're not going to get a full figure for a little while yet because Mr Anderson did bring the Chief Financial Officer with him, who in accountant speak told us that October hadn't ended and therefore everything hadn't been reconciled, but that we would have those figures, sort of obviously, I guess, for the February estimates, which are the second week we're back next year. I did make a rather helpful suggestion. I felt, though, that had they let Qantas know the $200,000 they'd spent on flights, they could have saved with all their yes voters.
Let's go to something that isn't funny, and this is their coverage of the issues in the Middle East at the moment. One of their correspondents, Tom Joyner, really horrific comments in relation to questioning the validity of the claims that babies were beheaded. We know they're not claims. They were beheaded by Hamas. He calls it BS. He says the word worse than that, in a WhatsApp group with a whole lot of international media. You took him on. Have a listen.
We're looking at a story that was quite awful to say out loud, that involved 40 babies, and we contacted the IDF about that, and they were unable to verify that that had happened. His language was unfortunate. He knows that he's distressed people by using that language. As I said, he's quite remorseful that that happened.
So are we still paying this journalist?
Well, we are still paying this journalist. He has, though, been relocated from Israel. I had asked questions to Mr Anderson of what had occurred, because not only was it incredibly hurtful to Israelis and Jewish Australians who saw the use of that language, but this is a reporter on a WhatsApp group with hundreds of international journalists, as Mr Anderson quoted today, who damaged our reputation, that our national broadcaster, that this was the hill that this guy was prepared to die on. Like, it wasn't enough that babies were dead, that, you know, the method of them being killed, you know, he wasn't going to buy. But I did ask Mr Anderson what had happened, and apparently he was remorseful and had been spoken to by his manager. I asked him before the lunch break to just confirm where Mr Joyner was today and where he was expected to be next week. My understanding is he has taken a break. He has left Israel. But he will be returning to his post with the ABC, but based out of Istanbul, where he has been previously posted. But it's a point.
And do we know if he's still going to report on Middle Eastern politics, though? Is he going to report on the Middle East? Doesn't matter where he's located. If that's his viewpoint, if he's still got the same viewpoint, geography is not going to make much difference.
Absolutely. No, and look, I couldn't agree more. But the thing was, though, that was become apparent today, and I really hope Mr Anderson does. I've given him a whole lot of documents that we've tabled. This wasn't the only example. This kind of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiment, we had numbers of examples that we were able to give to Mr Anderson today, including a social media producer whose own social media was in breach of the standards. But this follows on from estimates earlier this year where we did see the termination of a gentleman who was working for them in the Middle East, who was a producer and a cameraman for ABC, who we also saw anti-Semitic tweets come from. And it does seem to be something, and I've put it to Mr Anderson, why does the ABC tend to attract anti-Semites to want to work there? Because there does seem to be an overwhelming lot of proof and evidence of people that work within the organisation who express these views and express them quite often in absolutely disgusting ways.
We know too he couldn't apologise to Heston Russell, who won a defamation case in court. He will be paid out close to $400,000 from taxpayer coffers. He's owed that money. The ABC was found out in court, but couldn't bring himself to apologise to him. I want to move, though, given you're a New South Wales Senator, the whole issues today around the Sydney City Council, even though you had this emphatic result across the country regarding the voice, and I'll say for people at home, you were the Liberal convener in New South Wales for the no case. Unlike some of your colleagues, you didn't have a each-way bet. You're very clear to back the party room position. What's this about? We're now embarrassed about our statues. We're doing a review of statues. I mean, this was the City Town Hall that refused to light up in its facade in Israeli colours, but clearly this is a push.
Well, and I think it's just further evidence that a lot of these people who are pushing the yes vote, and you do know me, Peter, I don't tend to be pretty vanilla. I think you know where I stand, and I was definitely a strong no supporter from the beginning. But these people who advocated yes and advocated heavily, and I'm not sure how often you were in Sydney during the referendum period, but the City of Sydney Council had banners absolutely everywhere throughout the CBD advocating a yes vote. So the money that would have been spent by ratepayers on the council would have just been unbelievable. And it's this inability to accept the result. New South Wales is getting very close, and I'm very confident we will get there, to 61% no. This is not a small and tight race that was in New South Wales. I mean, we know the Yes campaign didn't even bother with New South Wales because it was Tasmania and South Australia, the swing states, and, you know, we were in the bag already. And I think we've really shown we've got a higher no vote than Tasmania, yet this council who represents Sydney, which is, you know, I know I'm in Canberra, technically the capital of Australia, but I think if you ask most international tourists, they'd think it was Sydney. And yet we've got a council who wants to behave this way. And I mean, it's just obscene.
What about what happened today on a Sydney train? Jewish leaders have called for a worker to be sacked after a pro-Palestinian song was blasted through the carriage. Have a listen.
We love you all. Here's a song for you guys.
Now, as I understand it, Holly, this wasn't someone with a speaker on the plane, a passenger with a speaker on the train. This is through the train carriage speakers put on by an official of Sydney Trains. They say they're looking into it. They're aware of the videos on social media. But I tell you what, those sorts of images will go around the world, won't they?
I mean, it's awful. And think about how embarrassing it is for all of us who live in Sydney, but as Australians, when we saw those absolutely appalling protests where pro-Palestinians were calling out the most vile anti-Semitic rants out the front of our opera house. And now we're going to see a social media on Sydney trains. This isn't Sydney. This isn't, you know, this amazing city that I love, and I'm heartbroken. And I mean, if this is a Sydney Trains official, I mean, the guy's feet should not touch the ground with the speed that he is fired. It is absolutely outrageous. But I cannot comprehend. You might have a view with regards to Palestinians and the two-state solution and how things have been working through. But to be seen to celebrating what Hamas did just a few weeks ago, and we know Hamas was who initiated all of this conflict that we're now seeing, and to be seen to be celebrating this, we just mentioned the babies, but the other atrocities that occurred when Hamas invaded through Israel and you know, young people at a music festival, the kibbutz, the family homes that were raided, how anyone can be seen to celebrating any of this sort of behaviour is actually incomprehensible and just disgusting.
Well, well done to you, Senator Hughes, and your colleagues today in Senate Estimates. I mean, that's the power of Senate Estimates, taking the ABC today to task. There'll be someone else tomorrow. Thank you for your time. It's incredibly important estimates. If you can watch online, get onto the website aph.gov.au. I tell you, this is your democracy at work, particularly because it's your money. After the break, though, we'll get into the Middle East with my panel, Michael Danby, of course, Kosher Garda. Welcome back. You wonder what we talk about in the breaks. We're both fired up, Michael Danby and I, about the Port of Darwin and the government rolling over on rescinding that lease agreement with the Chinese government, or a Chinese affiliate, let's call it the Chinese government. But I'll get to that in a moment. We're going to start, though, tonight with the Middle East. Joining me now, Sky News contributor Kosher Garda, former Labor MP, of course, Michael Danby. Thank you both for your time. We're hearing today the Americans have revealed that Iran is facilitating attacks on the Middle East, on US forces in the Middle East. They will now send military advisors to Israel. A ground invasion of Gaza still imminent. But Israel has been asked by the US to put that on pause. How long? We don't know. Hamas terrorists are still holding, of course, Jewish people, civilians hostage. And Iranian-backed Hezbollah, so that's in the north near the Lebanese border, they've exchanged fire with Israeli soldiers in southern Lebanon. Kosher Garda, it is a tinderbox. What's happening next?
Big question. The way I see the landscape is there's three dynamics over here. So one is the actual battlefield is unfortunately expanding and escalating around Israel. And while it's a very capable military, war is costly and bloody. And I hate to say it, but it sounds like we're moving in that direction. The second dynamic is the geopolitics and the geopolitical battlefield and how that's happening, being led by the US, of course. Lots of division back home, both in the Democrat Party that Biden is the head of. There's a big faction that doesn't want involvement, who's more friendly to the other side. The Republican House is in gridlock and they don't want to greenlight more funding, so he's navigating that.
And we still have got a speaker, of course.
And don't have a speaker, so that's all kind of manifesting into this. And then the third thing, I think, is a battlefield of public opinion. And we're just really seeing this is so far away from consensus right now in terms of the dynamic and who's innocent and what people should do, and that's getting uglier by the minute as well. So it's a big picture, and a lot, I think, is going to keep moving.
And look, remind me just quickly for people at home, unlike in Australia, the formal precedence order in America, the Speaker's number 3, isn't it?
2 heartbeats away from the presidency.
Right. And number 1 and number 2 on that chop. You know, if we've got a vacant seat in number 3, some would argue that's a better outcome than the first.
Some would argue that.
That's dangerous, isn't it?
It is, and we're back to the drawing board there, where there's 9 candidates now, and that's an outcome of just the long brewing civil war in the Republican Party, is what's leading to this.
Michael, you are a frequent visitor to the Middle East. All of these issues now, we're seeing Iran mentioned in almost every second column I'm reading. Every cross has got some mention of a supreme leader and either overt or covert Iranian involvement. How concerned are you?
Well, the IRGC is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards is behind all of this. They and the Ayatollahs are absolutely crucial to this. The Israelis are shocked going from, start-up nation to an existential threat on 3 fronts, all headed by Iran. They're less naive about Biden and co than many other naive Westerners, and especially since they rightly judge that Biden and co are responsible for the disastrous position that the world is in because of their indulgence of the Iranians over the last 2 years. And the crucial thing...
$6 billion.
Absolutely. And the crucial thing, Peter, is do the Ayatollahs think that Biden has the ability to use the military power that he's assembling over there? It's not a question just of your capacity, the 2 aircraft carriers, but have you got the will to use them as this increasing attack of the Iranians all around the region, directly on Americans, via Hezbollah on Israel, and certainly via their stooges and Hamas.
It reminds me of, speak softly and carry a big stick. The threat only works if someone thinks you might use that big stick, and that's the question mark with Biden, isn't it?
It is, and based on past record, you wouldn't be 100% confident after Afghanistan. I think that's the assessment that hardheads like Putin and the Ayatollah have made about them. But this threat of using a long-range missile directly from Iran, attacking American ships in the Red Sea, attacking American bases via their proxies in Iraq and Syria, it's outrageous.
But who would have
the address is Iran, the address is Tehran.
Who would have thought they would cross the border when they did? Who would have thought it wouldn't have been picked up by the Israelis? Who would have thought that the degradation of human life of civilians would be as extreme as it is? I mean, I think we're in uncharted waters. I'll go to Coach in a minute, but just quickly, Port of Darwin. I thought Albanese said he didn't want the Port of Darwin leased to the Chinese in opposition. Why roll over in government?
Because he's going off to Beijing to, have a make-up with Xi. It's he got the journalist back, although we left one other Australian there. I think this is what people don't understand. This is not a normal Labor government. Bob Hawke would have been in Israel like a flash. Remember, he was there with Golda Meir during the 1973 war. This is a socialist left government. It's not a normal Labor government. They're weak on defence procurement, they're weak on the Port of Darwin, and they're weak on Israel and terrorism. And it'll come back to bite Australians.
I'm going to have to owe you that time next week. I'm sorry, Coach.
No problem.
We got caught up on all of those issues at the end. Right, we'll speak to you soon. Sadly, I don't think the issues will abate. Right, that's
no, it's going to get worse.
Your company, as always, Andrew Bolt's up next.